So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this LaingBuisson webinar, introduced in conjunction with Bevan Brittan, our partners for this purpose, in which we're going to be looking at the 5-year forward view, 5-year plan published earlier this year by the Care Quality Commission. We're delighted to be joined this morning by two representatives from the CQC, and I'll come to them in a moment. Following them, we shall be hearing from Bevan Brittan from a legal perspective about the implications of the CQC's plans for the social care sector and indeed the wider health and care sector. And then finally, we should be joined by an old friend of LaingBuisson, Pete Calverley from Barchester. The purpose of this webinar, it couldn't be better timed actually, given the newspaper coverage over the last few days of the government's plans for legislative change affecting the health service, although they've been very unclear in truth about the extent to which those plans include the social care sector and how the much vaunted but important, critically important links between health and social care are going to be reflected in their plans for the management structures of the health service. I think it's fair to say the CQC in their document earlier this year were rather ahead of the game. And it's very good, from my point of view at least, to see the CQC focusing on the themes that are identified in their document: the importance of listening to service users and to communities, the importance of looking beyond institutions to the delivery of a joined-up service, the importance of focusing on safety, and the sense in the document that the CQC is moving well beyond, has been for some time actually, moving well beyond a role in life as inspectors with clipboards, rather more a real-time focus on improved service for those who rely on these essential public services. So these themes we shall be exploring in this webinar. I shall be introducing each of our speakers in turn, but we plan to leave a good half hour, hopefully, at the end of the webinar, when the participants, we hope you will put questions and comments both through the chat function and also, if you wish to contribute to the live discussion, through the Q&A function of Zoom. I'm not going to give instructions on how to use Zoom. I think we've all been doing it for so long now that we can find it hard to imagine life without Zoom. Maybe a happy day not too far around the corner where we don't have to rely on it quite as much as we do at the moment. However, without further ado, I'd like to go straight to the representatives this morning of the Care Quality Commission and to David James, who's going to be speaking, introducing the forward view, the 5-year plan of the Care Quality Commission. David James, who's the Director of Adult Social Care at the CQC. David, you're extremely welcome, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for promoting me as well. Sadly, just the head of adult social care policy, but I'll see if I can take your promotion forward with my superiors and see if I can make that one stick. But good morning, everyone.
Use me as a referee.
I will do, thank you. I'm sorry if it looks like I'm trying to obscure my identity. It's particularly sunny in Leeds this morning, but I hope you can see me clear enough. So thanks very much for having me. It's great to be able to talk to you this morning about our plans for our strategy for the next 5 years. So I think the first thing to say is that CQC's purpose won't change. We are established as the independent regulator of health and social care, as you all know. And our purpose is to make sure that health and social care services provide people with safe, effective, compassionate and high quality care. And we encourage services to improve, and that's not going to change. But as we come to the end of our current strategy and we look forward ahead to the next 5 years, we're considering how we do need to evolve, how we need to improve. So we are looking at how we can improve our regulation to improve care for everybody. And this has been obviously a very strange year and a time of particular focus and particular challenges. And that one thing that's drawn out for us is the inequalities that exist in health and social care. So that is something that cuts through our strategic themes. And we also want to be more flexible in terms of how we respond to risk and how we respond to the good news as well, and actually regulate with more flexibility and be able to respond to risk and the uncertainty as well that we encounter. I think one thing we've seen through this year and increasingly over a number of years is how the importance of how providers work with one another within a system, and the importance of how well that system operates and the impact that has on people's quality of care and on their quality of life. So we really do believe that as we move forward, that it's not quite enough to just be continuing to look at providers in isolation. We need to work out how we can balance that with a system view and looking across providers. So I'm just moving to the next. So I'm on slide 3 now, actually, Jade. Sorry, so slightly leaping ahead. Our strategy is built on 4 themes, which all interlink, and at their heart there are these overarching themes around a focus on systems and on tackling inequalities. I'll go on to speak about each of these themes in turn, but as you can see them there, it's about a renewed focus on people and communities, delivering a smarter regulatory approach, understanding how we can drive increased safety through learning and understanding and driving improvements in learning and safety culture within providers, and a stronger role and a clearer role in accelerating improvement in quality. So I'll take each one of those in turn. So on people and communities, we really feel we need to do more, and we can do more to put people's needs and wishes and expectations at the heart of how we regulate and how we look at providers and how we look at systems. We already do a lot of work through a number of means to gather people's views, but there is more that we can do, and perhaps this morning we can get some more ideas from yourselves as to how we might want to do that. This is really about enabling people to provide feedback in a way that works best for them. So expanding that set of options that people have, continuing to build our partnerships with local health watch, local advocacy groups and others, and exploring as well how we can make better use of digital channels, whether that's existing through social media or actually do we need to build some systems that enable people to give feedback in a way that works for them, really. And another theme that I'll probably touch on as I talk through the four themes is how all this relates to how we describe quality and how we probably can do more on that. And again, it'd be great to hear people's views. And in relation to this theme, there is something here about empowering people to understand much more clearly and readily what to expect from health and social care. I think there is more that we can do on that, and I think that builds on what we've done in our current strategy to encourage a shared view of quality. There is more that we can do. We can helpfully, I think, lead a conversation about can we get a more detailed consensus on quality and something that actually speaks to people's experiences and expectations. So just moving on to the next theme, which is smarter regulation. This is about us making better use of information and having a more flexible approach, targeting our approach to the nature of the evidence that we require in order to make our judgments, whether that's about celebrating success or following up on risk and issues of safety. Essentially, this is looking towards a situation where inspection is not the only way to gather evidence. Of course, that will always have a place in what we do. And there are certain things that the only way you can understand a service is actually by visiting and observing. But equally, there are lots of pieces of evidence that we currently collect and that we make judgments on and we look at in order to come to a decision on ratings, that actually we can do in different ways. We can do that by provider can submit. There's other ways of capturing that information. So we just want to target our approach and be more flexible to the actual needs of the evidence that we need to make judgments. And part of that is going to be building our evidence base and working with our partners across health and social care to do that. We're not equal across all the sectors we regulate in terms of the amount of data that we've got access to, but across all the sectors there is a wealth of information. So how can we turn that information into data and usable data that not only we can use, but the whole system can use to drive improvement? Going on to the third theme, improving safety through learning and having a real focus on safety cultures and learning cultures. I think probably one thing to draw out here, again, looking back to the shared view of quality, there is no current consensus or national agreement on what we actually mean by safety in different settings. So perhaps there's something we can do to reach that consensus. Part of this will be about, I think one building block of this is our regulation around duty of candour. And we've heard from providers and from our own staff and from other partners that actually it's not particularly clear. That's a particularly thorny regulation to navigate. And we're, as part of a first step towards improving our focus on safety, we are publishing a much clearer and much shorter guidance on duty of candour in March. But really, I think this is going to be about how can we get under the skin of the culture of services. And it may well be that as we look to how we assess this is actually more about well-led than safety. I think something that we need to consider as we move forward is how our 5 key questions, which won't change, we'll still be looking to answer those 5 overarching key questions. How do they interrelate and interact with one another? And where do we need to focus on in order to understand quality? And then finally, our theme on accelerating improvement. And again, this is linked to the need to have a clearer articulation of quality, which will really help people to understand and benchmark where they are, providers to understand and benchmark where they are on that spectrum of quality. What we're starting to hear through our strategic engagement events like today is people have really appreciated through the pandemic the shift in approach that we've taken. So when we stopped inspecting, we increased the contact that we had in many of our sectors with providers through our supportive conversations and through our transitional monitoring approach. It actually means we've actually been speaking to providers more than we would have, and we're certainly hearing lots of support for that. So part of this is going to be about how do we build our capability to have those relationships and support our staff to have the right skills to have the most meaningful and constructive conversations with providers. And I think it does go back to the assessment framework as well. And again, this is what we're starting to hear, is that our assessment frameworks, our judgments, they're quite broad. And if you really want to get under the skin of what is behind a judgment, then you actually have to go in and read those inspection reports. And that's not necessarily the most efficient way of drawing out insight from our findings. So I think there's something here about how can we structure our assessments in a more transparent and structured way, so that providers can actually get feedback on individual aspects of an assessment, whether that's, if they send in their policies and procedures around a certain topic, then actually arguably we should be able to provide a view of that, and they can understand at that granular level where there might be a need to focus more attention. And also this theme is about how we continue to build our partnerships across health and social care, so that we can build that coalition and focus on the priority areas for improvement. And I am probably coming up to my time here, so apologies. Finally, alongside our overarching strategy, there's a slightly more targeted document, which you might have seen. This slide here just summarizes some of the aspects there. Part of that document gets into a little bit more detail about exploring us moving away from set frequencies for updating ratings. It also talks about what I've mentioned, which is about different ways of gathering evidence and how we've piloted that with home care agencies and with GPs. And also that we want to be a bit more agile and a bit smarter in how we consult. This isn't about not working with our partners and with our stakeholders in when we change. There'll be no surprises, but we just want to not necessarily have to always rely on the big set piece consultations, and continue exploring and building on the way that we've been using to engage with our stakeholders to understand how we can change and how we can improve together. Last but not least is just how you can share your thoughts with us, and please would definitely welcome what you have to say on that against both of those consultations, which you can see on the screen there. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. Just before we go on to our partners from Bevan Brittan, there's one question that I suspect will come up from very large numbers of people in the audience that is a regular with the CQC, and it's a long-standing question, particularly in the context of the emphasis that you place increasingly on a commitment to work with services committed to improvement. And that's when a service gets a rating that it knows it's got to improve, maybe because it says requires improvement. Is the CQC planning to be more flexible in future in dealing with those kind of services to allow them to register the fact that they have improved? Because that's clearly a key business issue as well as a patient safety care quality issue.
It absolutely is, and the short answer is yes. If we do this right, then it ought to be really clear when that bar has been met, because we will have that more granular view of evidence and how that is stacking up against a clearer set of standards. Because at the moment, I don't think our standards are clear enough to providers and to the public. So it'll be much clearer kind of when that beaker of water is filling up, essentially, and we're kind of tipping to that point where perhaps there's a significant change. But the other point is it won't necessarily need an inspection to change that rating. We want to get to the point where we can nudge those ratings up and down, admittedly, on the basis of what the information is telling us. And so there's a big conversation for us to have there about, so what is that evidence set, and is it significantly different from what we have now? But yeah, the short answer is yes. I think that is one of the benefits of the approach that we're putting forward here.
Okay, well, I suspect that will be something that people will want to comment on, both in this webinar and also through the consultation process. But David, thank you very much, and I'm sorry that the names on the screen were not such that I got your title precisely right, but you're clearly worthy of being a director.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, for speaking this morning. Could we move on now, please, to Suon Griffiths, who's a partner, yes, accurately a partner in Bevan Brittan, and is going to be the first of two speakers from Bevan Brittan. Suon, you're extremely welcome. We look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, David, for that really helpful overview. It's I think from my discussions with providers across the sectors, it's the 5-year strategy is very welcome, and it's really good to know that the intended direction is a regulator that's going to be more flexible and dynamic moving forward to meet the challenges and all the innovations in health and social care. But obviously that's a sort of a skeleton document at the moment, and there are quite a few questions. So I just thought I'd just reflect on some things that have occurred to us having reviewed the document. So in terms of my first slide, and the next one, yeah, so first of all, collection and use of data. So CQC is going to be using sort of much more data sources to undertake this ongoing assessment. And I suppose I just have a few questions on that, is sort of what's different this time. CQC are saying that they're going to hopefully sort of not be requesting as much from providers, because they'll be getting the information from other sources. And I suppose my question is, that's something that's been raised and thought about doing before, and so will this actually happen this time? And also in terms of the data sets, there's always been this issue that in certain sectors there's a much more clear standardized data sets that can be used for assessments. So is CQC confident now that that's the case across all sectors? I think it's clear that in terms for providers, they'll need to have more digital data ready to be able to share with CQC. And just a thought there is that there'll be different, well, providers will be holding data in different ways digitally, and just the need for CQC to be aware that their system can speak to the systems of all providers, you know, however sophisticated they may be. I think in terms of CQC talking about sort of clearer standards of quality, what does good quality care and outstanding care looks like? I think that's really positive, and a better definition of what safe care looks like, and that interpreted across the sectors, that's really good. My question then is, what does that mean for the current CLOEs? Are we talking about new CLOEs, or are we going to get rid of the existing CLOEs? And I suppose I was just thinking that actually a lot of governance systems now are set around the CLOEs. So I just thought that was something to think about. As you've already said, David, in terms of ratings, they're going to be changed more fluidly moving forward, and I think that's very welcome, particularly for providers who felt that, you know, the old system, sometimes they were sort of, for want of a better word, stuck on a rating and couldn't move it. So having sort of more real-time ratings is something good. But I suppose the question then is also how transparent and consistent is that process going to be? What does it look like moving forward? And you know, how will providers know that they're going to have changes of ratings? And I appreciate that the second consultation is saying that that framework is going to be put in place this year. And then in terms of shorter reports, again, I think that has to be something that's welcomed, but from a fairness perspective, there has to be a real balance in terms of a provider understanding what the evidence is that has sort of made a particular judgment and rating for that provider. So it's important that there is that balance in the evidence in any report, or however the evidence is going to be presented moving forward. And the next slide, please, Jade. Again, the voice of the provider, of the service user, sorry, is going to be much more prominent. And I think there will be a need for providers to be much more active and innovative, actually, in the ways that they are going to collect feedback. And I think that's been the case, actually, over recent years. And it'll be interesting to hear what Pete has to say on that in terms of what Barchester Healthcare are doing. But again, it's sort of getting that feedback from service users. It's needing to use that feedback proportionately, so that and understanding from CQC how sort of a negative comment from a service user is going to be used proportionately and weighted proportionately in the assessments. I think in terms of this idea of looking at safety cultures is clearly positive, and it's quite a shift, I think, for CQC in terms of not just looking at when things have gone wrong, how has a provider responded to it and learnt from it, but sort of providers needing to demonstrate more proactivity in terms of continually learning and training and ensuring that they've got the expertise. So that's really positive. And I suppose a reflection then, CQC are quite clear in the strategy that where things take too long or changes are just not sustainable by providers, they're going to use their powers far quicker. And I think that will mean more enforcement action by CQC, and that's certainly been the trend, particularly over the past year, 2 years, where more criminal enforcement powers have been used. So I think that's to be expected. And just finally on technology, I've already talked about this sort of data collection and sort of digital data collections moving forward. But in terms of service delivery, it's good to see that CQC are going to embrace looking at more innovation when it comes to service delivery, which will be more digital in some aspects. But I suppose it's just ensuring that CQC inspectors and those who are assessing services sort of are also understanding this innovation and prepared to reflect on it more than perhaps they have in the past. And I'll move on to Carlton.
Thanks, Sue-Ann, and morning, everyone. I just wanted to pick up on a few things, which starting with a specific point, really, in the strategy consultation about the possible move to registering additional entities within corporate groups. CQC deal with this in the strategy under the heading of focusing what matters most. And CQC talk about the possible expansion of the definition of who is regarded as carrying on a regulated activity and making sure they're registered. And you'll see they talk there about a move to make sure that everyone who's responsible for directing and controlling care will be registered and held accountable. So in terms of what that looks like, if you just skip to the next slide. Just as an example, here we've got an example of a corporate group, of a provider group running 6 locations down the bottom through 6 different operating companies, providers A to F. And at the moment, that is the tier, provider A to F, which is registered by CQC and where the enforcement and inspection powers sit. I guess it'll be interesting to see how this strategy plays out, because clearly the possibility is there, depending on how it's structured, to shift up accountability further up the chain and possibly to require the next tier of companies, or even potentially the top company, depending on how a group is structured, to also be registered. Again, if you just look at the next slide. Now, this isn't, what will the test be for how CQC decide which services need to be registered, which entities need to be registered? This isn't entirely new. We had a consultation from CQC 3 or 4 years ago where they were talking about this. And I appreciate that thinking may have moved on internally. It'll be interesting perhaps to hear a bit more about that. But the last time this was on the agenda, CQC indicated that there were broadly 3 tests for deciding when an entity would be required to be registered further up the corporate group, depending on what activities it was carrying out. So firstly, if that superior entity was managing quality assurance systems and holding the operating companies accountable for delivering against them. Secondly, if the parent company is putting in place common policies around various operational matters, whether that's staffing levels, clinical governance, health and safety, etc., which are implemented across the group. And thirdly, if the superior company is making employment decisions about who's actually involved in delivering care on the ground. As I say, that was CQC's take on this 3 or 4 years ago. It'll be interesting to see whether the thinking is still the same, and an interesting space to watch, because providers and investors may need to take this into account in terms of how businesses are structured. That's a specific point, but just to finish with a few more general points, I guess, from me. In the strategy, we've spoken about, we've heard about the initiatives around improvement. It's clear that there's going to be a raising of the bar for good, and it's clear that what's been good enough in the past is not necessarily going to be good enough in the future, and providers need to be aware of that. Historically, there's been interesting issues around special measures regimes put in place by CQC, whereas for the NHS that has some real significance in terms of an element of support and input which NHS providers get when put into special measures. The same label's been used in the independent sector without any support coming along with it. I think the move around improvement and the initiative around improvement is perhaps a helpful step forward on that front. CQC indicating that they will be signposting and directing providers to sources of support, whether that's guidance, best practice, or possibly even to other providers. And I think that's a useful step forward. There's also talk about benchmarking data being released by CQC, which again I think will be of interest and help to providers to know where their services sit. The one question for me about that is particularly in adult social care, will that benchmarking data differentiate between providers who are publicly commissioned services and those with purely private pay services, or a mix? In terms of the point about sector working, or probably that should be system working, we've heard a lot about that both today and generally over the last year, of the importance of that. And the strategy emphasises that again, about the need for all providers to look at their local systems, to look at their local health inequalities, and to design services around those, and then implement and operate those services to work jointly with partners. So it'll be important for providers to not only do that, but be able to evidence they're doing that, so they can show that to the regulator. We've heard that the regulatory regime under the Act doesn't really enable CQC to regulate systems as such. In terms of an enforcement way, it's focused on individual entities, individual providers. But there is a provision in the regulations at Regulation 12(2)I around each provider having responsibility to ensure the health and safety and welfare of service users at the interface with other services. And I wonder if that might become more important. But I guess the age-old problem is, if the reasons for difficulties in a particular system are due to commissioning, CQC's role in that area is still not as a regulator of commissioners, albeit that it does provide commentary. And finally, just a very quick point, there is mention in the strategy about CQC looking at how services will meet their social and ethical responsibilities, and around issues such as environmental sustainability. That's a really interesting new development. I do wonder whether there might be questions as to whether CQC has the powers and all the tools to take that forward. And I appreciate this is just a draft strategy, but we'll see how that situation moves forward. Thank you.
Carlton, thank you very much. And the point you just touched on in conclusion there of the linkages between the work that the CQC does and the work other regulators do in other sectors, that the suggestion is made by Elizabeth Zacharias, come back to it in the Q&A, about co-regulation with social housing providers. If we're looking across system, we can't all be responsible for everything. And the question of how those linkages are going to work, I think, is one that we may wish to return to. But thank you very much to you and to Suwan for your presentations this morning. If we may, could we move next to Pete Calverley? Pete needs no introduction to a LaingBuisson audience. He's the Chief Executive of Barchester Homes, Barchester Healthcare, I should say. And Pete, you're extremely welcome. We look forward to your view of the forward plans of the CQC.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for the invitation. We've got the first slide, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Pete Calverley, as Stephen said, CEO of Barchester Healthcare. We operate around 240 care homes and hospitals across the UK. I'd like to give an operator's perspective as to how our journey since I joined the business in 2014 is very much aligned to the principles of the CQC proposals going forward. As only 5 to 10 minutes, it will be brief, you'll be glad to hear. In 2014, we developed an approach called Quality First. This is because we believe that if every service put the quality of care and resident experience first, then the home or hospital will get the best reputation in its local area, become the provider of choice, and then, and only then, would commercial success follow. In order to do this, we put in place systems of governance, audit, feedback, learning, and improvement that are constantly being refreshed through experience. We augmented or recruited a team of quality improvement specialists, a dementia services team, a health and safety team, and a team of clinical development nurses. We developed a clinical governance database to record every accident, incident, complaint, and compliment, and a quality dashboard that has evolved over the years to currently give real-time analysis of every service's key metrics available to every member of the operational team, the quality team, and the executive team. Drilling into the QAR tab shows any current areas of concern from the latest internal QAR audits and CQC inspections, where the home sits versus its peers, and linear change in quality scores over time. Next slide, please, Jade. Every facility has a quality improvement review by our quality improvement specialists every 4 months, with the areas for improvement entered into our central action plan, which is then constantly monitored by our regional directors so as to ensure required actions are completed in a timely manner. Any overdue actions are escalated in an incremental way, so that ultimately, if they remain incomplete, they are automatically escalated to myself. Our quality improvement review takes 2 days and mirrors a CQC inspection. Every 3 months, each divisional operational team, typically 70 homes, will have a 10-hour meeting with the executive board where each home's quality dashboard will be reviewed in detail and appropriate improvement actions and interventions taken. This slide you see now shows the front screen of the quality dashboard, where each area of quality assurance can be drilled down into according to how it's RAG rated. This ranges from black for the poorest performing decile to blue for the best performing decile. Next slide, please, Jade. So clicking through on the QIR CQC tab on the main dashboard screen, we reach this screen which shows the most recent QIR and CQC inspections and how they rated in the 5 domains with details of the specific areas that require improvement, which are then translated onto the home's action plan. The historic trend of internal QIR and external CQC rating is also shown. Next slide, please, Jade. If, for example, we click on the clinical tab of the dashboard, we can see the home's current metrics in various clinical areas, such as pressure ulcers, falls, medication errors, choking incidents, etc. And we can then drill down into any particular type of incident and see the individual incidents details. Next slide, please, Jade. So here we see the redacted details of a particular residence incident, the actions taken and the outcome. Also, we see whether it was RID or notifiable and whether the duty of candour applied to this incident. Next slide, please, Jade. With the Quality First programme of continuous review, learning and improvement, we can see the improvement of our CQC good and outstanding ratings over time, which have now reached 88% good or outstanding, 7% above the CQC expected benchmark for our weighted service types, and currently 0 of our 240 services are rated inadequate. In terms of the CQC proposals, we would very much welcome the increased use of IT capability and the more frequent rating assessments, as some of our services that are rated RI have not had an inspection for up to 2 years, while our own internal QIR suggests they will be rated good or better. Next slide, please, Jade. A key area of the CQC's proposal relates to keeping residents and patients safe within our services. We take safety extremely seriously, not only in the elements that are currently inspected in that domain in CQC inspections, but also with a broader health and safety overview. We are delighted that Barchester has been the winner of the ROSPA Healthcare Services Sector Award for the last 2 years. Contenders for this award include not only all care home providers, but also all NHS and private hospital providers. Next slide, please, Jade. Another key CQC proposal is around talking and listening to people, whether they be residents, relatives, staff, or commissioners. We seek the views of, listen to, and respond to these stakeholders in an increasingly wide variety of ways, including not only in the ways outlined in this slide, but also with changing circumstances. For example, during the COVID crisis, we have sent weekly or fortnightly updates by email and letter to every single relative of our residents or patients, and we opened up a 24/7 coronavirus helpline for relatives and staff to contact at any time with any queries or concerns, such as the status and arrangement for visiting within a particular home and the COVID status of any home, so as to inform and reassure. Next slide, thank you, Jade. To enable to deliver the quality of care and customer experience we expect, we need a fully engaged and empowered workforce. In terms of engaging with and listening to our staff, we have a Barchester app whereby staff can access company updates and messages, our staff handbook, policies and procedures, our digital learning platform to complete elements of their training, benefits and rewards, etc. We have a whistleblowing line manned by an independent organisation 24 hours a day. We operate a John Lewis-style profit-sharing scheme that all home-based staff participate in, linked to the CQC rating of their home and its consequent commercial performance, whereby over 50% of our staff achieved a bonus last year. Our Celebrating Success programme awards £100 to every member of staff when a home has a good CQC rating published, and £500 each if it achieves an outstanding rating. These schemes are in place to recognise and reward staff for their contribution towards the quality of care and service achieved by the home. We carry out 2 staff surveys a year, the latest of which was carried out by Ipsos Mori in September and October last year, where we achieved an incredible 72% response rate, which is over 11,000 staff responded. Responses shown, which are on the right of this screen, they show that there's a very high morale and positivity within our workforce. You can see on that, just picking some out, 87% of our staff are proud to work for the company. 82% believe the company is run on strong values and principles. 80% would recommend us as an employer to their family and friends. 82% feel able to raise concerns and will be listened to. 80% would recommend Barchester if someone they love was looking for a care home, etc., etc. And it's relentlessly positive. And this was at the height of the pandemic. So very positive. But separate from that, apart from our in-house survey, we have independently ascertained staff sentiment regarding us as an employer. We participate in the independently assessed best companies accreditation survey, which is open to all sectors. For the last 2 years, we've achieved accreditation as a best company to work for through feedback from our staff, independently gathered by best companies. I believe we're the only large care provider to achieve this status in 2019 and 20. So in conclusion, as a provider, we take our responsibility seriously to ensure safe, high quality care to the people we look after, delivered by an empowered workforce, and fully support the CQC proposals. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Pete. I'd like, if I may, to go straight into Q&A, because there are some really quite strong themes coming out in the questions that I think it'd be good to get reaction across the panel. So what I suggest, if I may, is that I'm going to ask several people who've come into the Q&A on similar themes to pose their questions, and then rather than doing it one by one, then take that group of questions and ask the panel to respond to them. And the obvious one to start with is Sue Sleeth, who is asking the same question as actually comes up in several of the questions. How is it put most simply by Kathy Meacham, who says this sounds positive, but there's nothing in this as to how they're going to do it. There's a real challenge, isn't there, to be a regulator that has confidence in the sector and at the same time be more flexible. And Jerry Kennedy, inconsistency of individual inspectors' approaches to the job remains an ongoing concern year on year. What is the CQC doing about this? So perhaps if I can go first to David, because that's inevitably a concern for a regulator dealing in issues that in the end affect the ability of businesses to trade successfully. David.
Absolutely, and as everyone on this session will know, it is a challenge. It is a challenge to balance out how do you tell a story and allow that richness to come through at the same time and have that consistency of judgment. And I think we've made it harder for ourselves as a regulator in how our assessment framework has evolved. Would be my response. We have kind of evolved towards a dominance of what we call our key lines of inquiry, and perhaps to the detriment of some really clear expectations or standards. And I think part of what I was trying to get at when I was talking about people and communities, how can we evolve that assessment framework using the voice of people to set out much clearer expectations? And if as part of the smarter approach, we can then, against those clear expectations, line up the specific items of evidence. We have a much more transparent approach. I think perhaps too much at the moment sits in the background to be filtered through to a report. It won't necessarily all make it through to the report. So I think there's something we can do about flinging back the covers and actually exposing what evidence is considered, potentially scoring each piece of evidence. As I say, I think that's something to be explored. So you can actually see, as a provider, and the public can see, this is the standard you should expect, and this is how we arrived at a judgment as to whether or not we feel that standard is being met. So I think it's about having a much clearer and more structured approach, which will help us, and we'll always obviously continue to focus on our staff capabilities and skills.
Is there a process of training planned by the CQC to take forward this sort of more open approach? And if there is such a process of training, will there be opportunities for others who actually don't wish to be CQC trainers, CQC inspectors, but do have a need to know how CQC is thinking, so that it's not a purely internal process within CQC? That's one question I would have thought people would have in response to what you said.
Certainly. It would be part of our ongoing training. So we really are right at the start here in terms of what kind of framework do we think we need, and there will be other factors as well. But yes, we will set that in train. There's another piece of work which is just started perhaps 2 or 3 months ago, around how does CQC become better at learning? How do we learn more about and identify these areas of inconsistency and actually feed that back into our machinery and get more responsive and reactive? So that's going to be quite a big focus that will sit alongside this strategy, is that kind of quality management, I suppose, kind of piece, a quality assurance piece, kind of getting much strong ourselves, needing to go further to be a learning organisation and to identify these areas that are priorities for improvement.
I'm going to go, I'll pose the question to one of, for Sir Warren or Carlton from Bevan Brittan. From a lawyer's perspective, the prospect of a regulator being more flexible, and there's clearly a trap there potentially. So could I ask for a legal perspective, and then I'm going to ask Pete for his view from an operator perspective. Flexibility is a good thing, but it's sometimes difficult to predict.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chip in. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think we have lots of clients and who touch upon the fact that there is a need for a quicker turnaround around ratings. You know, as Peter said, when services have changed, and I think all of that move is really welcome. And in terms of delivering that, if CQC are producing perhaps more user-friendly reports, then that is welcome to an extent. And I think the difficulty for CQC is it's speaking to two audiences, really. It's speaking to the public and trying to give the public usable information. But at the same time, obviously, its reports have major significance on provider organisations and commercial issues. And so it needs to produce a report and an evidence base which is robust and transparent, and which the provider can push back on and challenge where that's appropriate to do so. And we see, under the current regime, we often see, well, not often, that's probably overstating, but we do from time to time see situations where CQC will make a judgment in a report which will be challenged by the factual accuracy process, only for CQC to come back and say, okay, we accept that challenge, but here's some more evidence we've got to justify our judgment, which the provider wasn't even aware of in the first place. And you can get caught in a loop around that, but it's, I guess it is that dilemma between making it user-friendly but at the same time robust.
As a provider, how do you react to the idea of a more flexible and potentially perhaps slightly less predictable regulation?
Well, I do welcome flexibility, and I welcome the suggestion that there'll be more responsive and frequent change in ratings and assessments. My concern is how this is delivered, and there is an inconsistency even at the moment, whereby if the concerns are raised with a service, CQC will quickly come in and potentially either listen that we've already picked the issues up and therefore allow us time to correct them, but sometimes they won't, and they'll change the rating negatively. But when the corollary of that should be when we think things are right, they will come in quickly, just as quickly, and reassess and reassure our service users and their relatives that actually the service is resolved. And my concern with this inconsistency is that key point about training and consistency and learning from it, and that if it is going to be more flexible, the balance of flexibility has to be, positive and negative, that it's flexible both ways, flexible for the provider and flexible for the regulator.
Okay. So on, you were unmuted. Did you have something else to say on this theme?
No, I totally agree, and I agree with Pete's point that actually the hope is that you can go up in terms of your ratings and not just down with this flexibility, because I'd always thought that was what was going to happen last time with the intelligent monitoring, but I think it was always, you know, it was risk-based to the point where if you were sort of looking like you should go down in rating, that's when CQC would be inspecting, but it never seemed to work the other way as well. So hopefully this flexibility this time will mean it'll work both ways. Yeah.
Sorry, Stephen, there. Just the point that Siobhan's just made is that somehow when this is implemented, at the moment that flexible monitoring where concerns are raised by either whistleblowing or local authority or resident relatives, and there's a swift response with CQC, but on the corollary we can produce evidence of hundreds of compliments coming in from a service, and that doesn't seem to prompt an early urgent response. It seems to be, it does seem to be a little bit unbalanced, and I hope any new regime implementation will have that proper balance.
That was the point of my question immediately after David's presentation, because this is a long-standing, as I said, it's a long-standing issue in the sector. And in fairness, David he gave a pretty straightforward answer, yes, that there was a desire on the part of the CQC to move more quickly in those circumstances. I'm focused on the fact that Christopher Drysdale, also from the CQC, is on the panel and has not so far, I'm not sure, between David and Christopher, since I promoted you to director, David, it's your call whether these are questions for you or for Christopher. Would you like to comment on that? You or Christopher like to comment on that discussion?
It probably are for me, really. I mean, Chris is here if anybody wants to get into the more detailed stuff that Carlton talked through with the registering of corporate entities. It's just really to reiterate, yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we are provider funded, so it is we are honor bound to live up to the challenge that has been set there by Pete and others. And I think my hope is that this is we're setting out the way that we can achieve that. And I suppose it's about broadening out your concept of risk. It's not just about risk of things going wrong. It's also about risk that rating is not correct, and risk that the public are not being served by the information that we put out there. That is also a risk that we need to be alive to and flexible and agile and to respond to quickly.
I'd like, if I may, to move the discussion on to a slightly different subject, which is the one that Carlton touched on in his presentation, and I picked up at the end of what he said, and is also in the Q&A from Elizabeth Zacharias in particular, asking whether how co-regulation works when the CQC moves to a more system-oriented view of the world. That inevitably means that it's looking at the experience of care that is the responsibility potentially of more than one provider. And the question then is how the CQC holds the group of providers responsible for the result that they deliver together, including in most difficult case, a provider of a service that isn't formally part of the CQC responsibility at all. And the example Elizabeth quotes is the social care, the social housing sector. How does the CQC plan to address those questions, David?
One way we've already started to address part of that, not the whole of it, is during the pandemic, we've been conducting these provider collaboration reviews, which have taken a thematic view of providers in a place and how they have worked together to be more than the sum of their parts, essentially. So I think one thing we want to do is to explore what is the long-term role of that type of thematic approach, focusing on an area and on topics. Equally, is there something about having something in our standards, our expectations, or in our lines of inquiry that we seek evidence for in a stronger way than we currently do about how well providers are working with others, and that would include non-regulated partners as well. And just to this specific point, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be answering the Q&As or not. I didn't want to miss anything from the other speakers, but I was just dropping a few answers in. I did mention there in that response, we are actually talking to the Regulator of Social Housing, because as the two organisations ourselves, we do realise there is something of a gap there, and we want to explore how we can work in concert. I think perhaps the final point is we won't have. It's unlikely we'll have a formal role across systems, but again, going back to the need for a clearer set of expectations of quality, if we can lead a conversation across our partners, and that would include the emerging ICSs, to reach a consensus of what we all mean by quality. We don't all have to measure exactly the same thing across the board, but there is surely common ground there that sits under those 5 key questions that we've all signed up to, that actually allow us to work more effectively, share information more efficiently, and not just be relying on kind of local relationships and conversations, but actually, if we all know what we mean by safe, and the public know what we mean by safe, we ought to be able to grow that amount, to turn that information into data, and to kind of drive improvement through less formal ways where we don't necessarily have regulatory oversight of systems.
I guess the question arises, doesn't it, where we know most people who use these services know that they will be they deliver outcomes that are best outcomes when they work together, when social care works closely with the community health system, when it works closely with the local GPs, the local hospitals. And it's more, very often, it's the failure of those organizations to work together that delivers the bad outcome. And it's how do we regulate and deliver all the objectives we have for the system as a whole, rather than for individual parts within it?
Yes, so that's a helpful prompt, Stephen. Thank you, because it's reminded me that alongside this strategy, we need to reorganize ourselves within CQC and how we're structured. Some of the people that are on this call today will remember that we used to have generalist inspectors, where you kind of had to inspect a hospital and then a care home the following day, and then maybe a dentist. We're not going back to that. What we have at the moment is 3 operational directorates covering hospitals, primary care, and adult social care. That's creating silos. So another way of tackling this, as well as that kind of clearer consensus on quality, is by structuring our teams differently. So we're exploring whether or not we can have a kind of cross-sector team structure, so that there's much more interplay and insight is pooled within those teams, so that our individual directorates, our internal directorates, aren't forming these silos, which obviously can happen with large organizations. So that to me feels like quite a positive step.
Carlton, you raised these issues in your presentation. How do you react to what you've heard?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely right. These are positive steps forward. I mean, I think CQC's hands are to a degree tied by the legislation, which only give it powers to take sort of sharp end enforcement action against individual entities. I do wonder whether there's a bit in there, as I mentioned, in the current regulations, which enables CQC to look a bit more closely, even within the current regulations, at what providers are doing around intra-entity work, and whether we might see that as more of a focus going forward for CQC's inspection, using its existing powers, which could ultimately result in, enforcement action. But I think it's an interesting, it's a useful step forward. I should say, just on that point, and just generally, I suppose there's been a lot of discussion in the chat about where are the details of all this, and I suppose, in fairness to CQC, this is a 5-year strategy plan, and there will be a lot more detail to be put on the bones as we go through all of this, all of these initiatives we've spoken about. I suppose one point we haven't touched upon is what further consultation there will be around those, the detail as we get round to it. I suppose I don't know whether Dave is able to talk about that a little bit, but if that's of use.
Yes, I mean, I would make this commitment now that we will engage widely and co-produce our approach. There shouldn't be any surprises for anybody. That's the approach we've taken to this stage. I'm aware that doesn't necessarily touch everybody, but we certainly put a lot of effort into making sure that we we gain as broad a view as we can and take that into consideration. It's still being formed, is the other part of the answer, but I would anticipate that we would want to be coming out and having quite focused conversations about what does a strategic single assessment framework and set of standards that really leaps off the page in terms of what people should expect from health and social care services, including how they interrelate and interact with one another. We want to come out and do that in the coming months. So this year, we want to do some quite targeted and quite detailed work on what do we need to change here in order to achieve those 4 strategic ambitions.
Yes, you and I have often talked about the need for better connections between the different elements of health and social care. Are we moving towards a more rational regulatory system?
So yeah, we have spoken over the years about this, Stephen. I think unless we join up commissioning of services within a whole community, so that's health, social care, mental health, all the services, housing, and there's a plan that actually is a joint commissioning arrangement that is joined up, and then you regulate it in a single way to assure its effectiveness. I just see things falling between, as usual, falling between 2 stools, things being missed, partisan behaviour, funding difficulties, and the money not flowing, and lack of planning and clarity. And I think, all of us, regulators, operators, commissioners, should be working together for that one aim. And I don't see that. I see initiative here and a joined up initiative maybe there, but I don't see the overarching plan that actually brings everyone around the table. So, okay, in an ideal world, how would you do this? And what does good look like? And what are the building stones to that? I just see sporadic piecemeal changes that don't seem to be joined up. And I can just see that is just a way for continuing confusion, as it always has been. And everyone's will is in the right place. But I think until someone holds the ring and actually brings all this thinking together as what good looks like, and what are the components that need to be put in place that delivers that good outcome, and that includes all of us, then, as usual, I'm generally an optimistic guy, but I'm not Nostradamus. I don't see this working as well as anything.
Well, there's 2 phrases that neither of which have passed anyone's lips yet. We've been going for over an hour, and one of them is local authorities, and the other phrase is integrated care systems. And I referred in my short, brief introduction to the fact that the government is now speculating in public about giving some kind of new legal form, in particular to ICSs. I wonder, and it seems to me that some of the direction of travel, as I said in the introduction of the CQC, is actually, I don't think it's miles out in front, but is marginally at least in front of the development of a new ICS. And I wonder whether regulation of ICSs and regulation of the whole of health and care delivered in a locality is the way that we move on from regulating individual providers to something that's more joined up. But I equally, as we think about how that can be done, it's clearly important that each individual contribution to that joined up continuum of care is itself accountable and defined and subject to regulatory oversight. David, none of that's easy, but those are the issues you're grappling with, aren't they?
Yes. So as everybody will be aware, we don't have any powers to regulate at the system level, and it's not necessarily on the cards that ICSs would come into our scope, but that doesn't mean all is lost. I think you make a really good point there, Stephen, about how do you regulate the constituent parts and also the whole. And I would go back to this idea that we really do need to crack this, what we talked about in our existing our previous strategy, the one that's about to expire, which we got so far along the line, but for my money, we could have gone further, which is a genuine shared view of quality. We do have that consensus at a very top level. So on the health side, we have the National Quality Board, who have signed up to a vision of quality, which aligns with our 5 key questions at CQC. On the adult social care side, we have the NQB's counterpart, which is the Quality Matters Initiative. So all the players there have got as far as saying, yes, quality means safe, effective, a positive experience, well-led, and the sustainable use of resources. That's great, but so what? How do you turn that into outcomes that would actually speak to people? So my mum went to the hospital recently, and she had, by all accounts, not a very good experience, but she had no idea where to measure that in terms of certainly what the law requires. And so there is some common ground here, and I do wonder if, as the ICSs are forming, if there is a need for them to, as a minimum kind of nucleus of a quality framework, to have regard to the fundamental standards of quality and safety. Even though they are not regulated, even though they are not accountable under the Health and Social Care Act to those standards, surely that is the floor that we kind of all stand on. And then from there, we can move to, okay, so what does good look like? If that's the kind of the minimum that at least the regulated aspects of systems need to abide by, then how do we build on that, but keeping that consensus? So I think that's the trick that we would like to pull off, is one set of standards, one assessment framework for health and social care, which empowers individuals to know what to expect and what rights the law gives them, which allows us to regulate providers, but which also allows us to have a more joined up conversation at system level. And if it's not formal regulation, then at least to comment using that common language of quality and that shared vision, which we can build together as to whether or not good and outstanding care is being delivered. We can't do it on our own, though.
Yeah, it must be right, mustn't it, that if the government are planning to give legal form to ICSs, to integrated care systems, the formal bringing together of NHS organisations and local social care organisations in a locality, if that's to be given legal form, it must surely be subject to CQC oversight, mustn't it? I pose that as a question, but Pete, do you give others thinking time? But I think I know your view of that.
So I do think we've got to put our weight and shoulder behind one solution. And if ICSs are that solution, other things have to change to make them effective. I honestly don't believe ICSs can work, or government more control, giving more control to NHS, Simon Stevens, or government intervening with the NHS will work while we have a foundation trust system. They are autonomous bodies that don't have to behave in terms of NHS requests, that they can be maneuvered in certain ways, but to have a foundation trust system running with autonomous bodies and hospitals and trusts working while we have trying to give everything to an integrated ICS system just doesn't work for me. And I think you've got to go back to basics. You've got to understand what is the vehicle for delivering most effectively improvements and delivering the expectations that we all have for quality of care and customer experience and patient experience. And when you decide what that vehicle is, what are the blockers that's going to make that less effective? We need to go through all of those. How will it be commissioned? How will it be funded? How will it work with how will it pull together and be given a framework to operate that local community, all the services, or commission all the services? And how will it be regulated in a consistent way that ensures it's operating in the most effective way for the people and the service users that are cared for within that system? And I think you can't keep coming up with standalone solutions. There's got to be a plan that actually says what good looks like, and that's my view. At the moment, the organisational structures that are all over the NHS and social care just will not fit into that effectively.
Go on. Do you want to contribute to this?
I totally agree with Pete, actually. I just think that it's just sort of so fragmented in terms of things being done in different sort of silos at the moment, and coming together and sort of having an overview is the only way it's going to work. And CQC really need to look at that and focus on sort of how do all the different systems work, and how should, what does good look like when all of these systems are working together. So I totally agree with everything you said there.
David, I'll give you a little thinking time. In sort of putting a slightly curved ball in, because we've only got 5 minutes left. First of all, do you agree with the proposition? Forgive my household noise. We've got somebody at the door and a dog doing what dogs do. The
same as happening here.
The process, if there is to be a process of progressive integration of the care economy in a locality, and the CQC is to have the role of the statutory regulator of care quality, seems to me it's almost follows as night follows day, that the CQC needs to be engaged in that process. The curveball I have is out of the questions. The one area we haven't covered is local authority responsibility, in particular for funding. And the CQC has a responsibility for oversight of the financial sustainability of care provision. And should that, in your, do you envisage that including a review of the way local authorities use their power to set prices for care in their particular locality?
Yes. So as we all know, as it came out at the weekend, the government are considering a role for us in local authority commissioning practice. It's not clear where the thinking is on that. We are working with them and with other partners on how that might best work, and to try and do so in a way which reflects the themes in our strategy, actually, and make sure that people are at the heart of any approach that gets designed. And part of that would be, yes, how that market is being managed by the commissioner, what fees are being paid would certainly be a part of that approach. Just a related point to the conversation we're having here, so I know we're almost out of time, but the conversation is only about local authority commissioning at the moment. There is no indication that we're aware of that we would have a formal role within at the ICS level, but it is something that we feel it would be valuable. We did our local systems reviews, 20 of them a couple of years ago, and they were very well received by the systems that we visited, and there was real insight and benefit from those, and that's something we would like to continue, whether that's a formal regulatory role or if it's something slightly to the side as a kind of an influencer and a whisperer in the ear, remains to be seen. But we're certainly keen to continue to help and add to the picture of quality in whatever way we can.
Can I just throw one more curveball? I mean, I don't know if this is what you were driving at, Stephen, but interestingly, when I was talking about corporate structures and regulating different entities, I was really talking about in the context of independent sector organisations. But I guess the same point could potentially be made if you're talking about giving organisational form to ICSs and using the language that CQC talk about in the consultation, that query whether that new regime of registration somewhere above the operating entity would apply in that environment as well.
I think not. This is I'm sort of shooting from the hip a little bit, but in our previous consultation on the registration changes, we did say, I believe, Chris will correct me if I'm wrong, that statutory bodies would be exempt, and I think these organisations are going to be incorporated in that sense as statutory bodies, so there probably would be a blanket exception. However, you're right, Carlton, those criteria that you run through on your slide, they would tick those boxes, at least one of those boxes, if not all three. So there is something there about how this can best be done and how we and others can help make sure that quality is delivered.
Yeah, that's right, Dave.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. We had to get a contribution from you before we concluded the session. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us this morning. I hope you found that a productive session, and thank you in particular for our panel. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of the day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I wasn't entirely certain that I was still being heard. I would be more generous. I think that was a rich discussion, and thank you to all the participants. Thank you to those who posed questions. Thank you in particular too to Bevan Brittan for partnering with LaingBuisson and making possible what I believe to have been an interesting and informative discussion. Thank you to Pete Calverley, to Siobhan Griffiths, to Carlton Sadler, to David James, and to Chris for his contribution at the end. Thank you very much, one and all.
Thank you.